at question 2 essays, we have to consider a couple of things with them. Question 2 essays always focus on characterization. And so if we're going to take a chunk out of a novel, we can't ask you about plot development necessarily because you've only got a chunk. Roughly, they're going to take like a page out of a book. So it's hard to do that. We've got to look at how do the characters respond and act in this moment. Question 2 essays, like question 1, will no longer have that list of literary, ask you the question on the text. Why? To do that, I'm actually going to refer to something that you are very familiar with from last year. Consider Jolliffe's rhetorical framework for a second. When students write the rhetorical analysis on the Lang exam, it is similar to writing the essays that we do here on this test, because we're really looking at how does a writer build meaning. By focusing solely on the stylistic and artistic choices that a writer makes, like diction or metaphors, you're wanting to go all the way down here to a stylistic choice rather than focusing on all the other things that a writer does. So in the case of a rhetor, when we look at rhetoric, they have to consider what their purpose is and how they're going to deliver that and appeal to their audience before they consider what's the choice in writing this one sentence. And so if you're like, why does Walsh keep hitting on stop talking about devices as a way to organize paragraphs? It's much the same as over there. If you're wanting to focus on the stylistic choice as the big thing, you're looking all the way here at the end rather than how do we construct the meaning? What's the meaning piece? And then using that choice as a supporting detail. So they're not going to give you that. Question 2 essays are always focused on balancing in the student mind between a couple of skills. First, comprehension. How well do you understand what you read? Second, how well can you analyze that thought to be able to see how that meaning is created? And third, coming up with that argument and composing it to tell us how the author builds the meaning in the passage. So those skills are really important as we think about how we're going to respond here. So let's start just with the basics. We have 2 characters in this passage, Rosamond and Tertius Lingate. How would you describe them? What are some adjectives that came to mind in having to describe these 2 characters?
Lingate is very much the provider. He's very sensible, though he does not listen to Rosamond, because Rosamond is like providing some ideas, but he just, I guess, doesn't listen ever. So he's not very good at listening. I think throughout it, I don't know why. I was trying to find it again, where I thought it talked about how Rosamond came from a more affluent background.
Yes, you are correct.
I was trying to find exactly where it said that, but I remember reading that. So
We will get there for sure. Anything you want to add?
That Rosamond is kind of submissive. Divisive with his words. He uses them to try to appease to what he's saying. She like tries to get out a lot of it. He's like, no, but it's okay.
Yeah, he's very conscious of how he's constructing his words, both at times to be hurtful or direct, but at other times to really appeal through. And we'll demonstrate that for sure. Anything else? Okay, so let's start to pull this apart and start to see. And in order to do that, I want to go all the way back up to the very beginning of this and look at the prompt for a second. Who wrote this passage?
Marion Evans,
Though she used a pen name. What's the pen name?
Georgia.
George Eliot. So we have a female using a male pen name. And she's writing about males and females in a relationship. If we're looking at a complex approach and how we can get multiple sides to a character, does a female have certain insights that she could lend to a male, especially if that female is writing under the guise of being a man? So consider as we're looking at that, we do have those pieces. Now, don't go as far as to say, oh, so there's some kind of a gender thing here. Just consider men and women see the world in very different ways. And if you haven't realized that, realize it. If you're frustrated with somebody of the opposite gender, it's probably because you're not realizing how they're approaching it. Simple way to look at it. You see it here in this one. When men are presented with a problem, they want to solve it, period. So they are going to provide solutions. Women, when presented with problems, want to talk. They don't want solutions. Walsh. Yeah. Okay. Women want to just talk. And so often it's what leads to arguments and struggles is that a woman will present a problem that she's having. A man will present his answer. Here's how to solve it. And the woman will not do what the man told her to do because she's not looking for an answer. She's just looking to externalize. Do we see things like that happening here in the passage? On both sides. Solutions being presented, the other side not listening. And so she's aware of how men and women communicate, and she's using that to her advantage. If we start to look at some of the things that click here, let's start with your point that you brought up here with this. She comes from money, where you were like, oh, I know it's in here. I can't find it. Anybody have that line? Look down like 20 through 25.
To imagine fully what this sudden trial was to a young creature who had known nothing but indulgence and whose dreams had all been of new indulgence, more exactly to the taste.
Yeah, so if you look there, we can start to go, okay, where are we finding these pieces? Taking that extra step to be able to say, hey, if I've got this characterization that's coming out, how am I seeing it delivered here? We got that. Think about too, what's Rosamund's initial reaction to how they can solve this problem? Her father. Did you ask Papa for money? But if we look, think about what you mentioned about Tertius being a provider, being sensible. Does he want to go to her dad to solve his problem? Not at all. So when we're looking there, being able to kind of take these thoughts and go, okay, where are those lines is going to help you to deconstruct this passage to figure out how it works and what we have. We're not going to do that with every last point here, but I think it's key. It's something we should look at. When we start to look at like, okay, we got a feel for these two characters. I want to challenge some things. Give me an example where Rosamund is submissive.
Rosamund sat perfectly still. The thought in her mind was that if she'd known how wicked and inhumane, she would have never married him.
So we're on the right-hand column towards the very bottom. This is like line 77 through 79. Here, she has this. Would you call that submissive?
Not exactly. I feel like there's a better. section for that.
I think there's a better word, and I think that I'm also going to challenge to go, I want you to compare this quote instead and think about who we're speaking of. If we go up that column and we look at lines 48, 49, 50, I want you to look at Lingate. Lingate was bowing his neck under the yoke, like a creature who had talons but who had reason to, which often reduces us to meekness. Now, one word that may have thrown you here is yoke. Do you know what we're talking about? Can you describe it?
It's like a wooden thing that they use to attach to an animal to like a plow.
Yes.
So
So when we're thinking about a yoke, it is something that creates a submissive situation. We domesticated animals to wear it so that we can put them to work. So here to say that Lingate was bowing his neck under the yoke, would that better describe him as submissive to this situation? And think about too, they describe here that he is a creature who had talons, but who had reason to. Lingate understands that he can hurt his wife very easily with his words. And we have examples of that in here. You pointed that out. There are moments that he is decisive and definite, but he also possesses reason. Take a look at the lines that run from on the left-hand column 32 to right before that bit about the yoke, right about 47. Reread them and pay careful attention to the pronoun use that you see there. Okay, so one thought that came up when we were talking about Tertius Lingate is that he has a consciousness of his word choice. How do we see it emphasized here in that little section?
Like when he says something that he knows would be unappealing for her to hear, he tries to he's like darling dear.
So we have some of those uses of pet names there, and we see it at other moments too, where they know how to use those names to appeal to the other. How about the pronoun use? Notice what he said when he uses I versus we versus something in reference to his wife, Rosamond.
all the art statements is like talking about he's taking all the fault, all the blame, it's my fault.
Yep.
Whereas the we is just like, hey, we gotta do this together, we gotta like get through it together as a couple. And then Rosamond herself, it's just like, dear, please forgive me, like, mercy on me.
And you also notice that he tries to appeal to her intelligence. You could come up with ideas. You're so smart. And this or that. He is very intentional here. And especially if, just having looked at that rhetorical situation stuff, this is very much, Tertius Lingate as rhetor, trying to control the message, trying to be there. And so think about how this section can be used to support the concept of Tertius Lingate as a creature with talons, but who had reason to. Of a creature who is bowing under the yoke. Because in essence, whose fault is this?
Rosamond's,
Exactly. Rosamond's tastes, her indulgences, her spending have gotten them into this situation. She doesn't understand that, money isn't there. It's completely out of her experience. And so rather than blaming, he is having to bow under the yoke. I know this is not my problem. These are not easy words to have to say, but ultimately we are trying to find the solution. So if you notice, do you see how we're approaching meaning first in how we're framing our conversation? And then really looking at what are the choices the author makes there to support those understandings we walk away from. So we're kind of going, I might frame a conversation about how Tertius Lingate is that creature with talents, but with reason too. I would use this section and the pronoun usage, how this is constructed to show how he's putting his reason there. And I would probably end the paragraph by talking about how he now views himself as having to bow under the yoke. Are you seeing that constructed bit and how I'm building meaning? I'm focused on what the meaning is and how it's constructed, not, hey, where's a metaphor? Some other things that we could definitely look at here that didn't come up yet. Did anybody pay attention to physical distance?
Yeah, the baby spot. There were 2 meters, I read.
Mm-hmm.
So
So we have a very kind of distinct concept of how distant they are. And then as they talk, what happens? They slowly move closer. You'll take note at times where they might even touch. But then if we go back to the very end there, where you had pointed out that idea of, she's now quiet. And she has kind of gone. She's sitting perfectly still. And we notice that, Lingate tries to be gentle. Did you look at the back? Why did they include that last little bit?
it's sort of jokingly saying that so they've come to understand the situation, but it isn't fixed yet. They can understand that they're in this together.
How would you describe that joke? Is that a funny, are they both laughing?
No.
No. So what is that a use of? It is. But I think we also have to understand the sarcasm of what we have here. Remember, sarcasm differs from normal humor because there is an intentional attempt to hurt in being sarcastic. You are attempting to inflict pain. And so here, that idea of, are we to go without spoons and forks then? It is a hyperbole. We can't imagine that anybody in society would really be like, you know what, just sell them, we'll make do. We got hands. It's there, but she's really trying to just get that last little bit in. But notice how this goes with her determination to not put up a fight. And then what we have in that last bit. She was determined to make no further resistance or suggestions. Look at the last word in this argument. Just like a woman is hurtful, it's a joke. It's hurtful. She wants to get in that last little bit. She wants to be sarcastic. She wants to leave it on that kind of an end. How many times do you tend to do the same thing when you're maybe talking with your parents, where you almost hope that you can get that last bit in and just walk away with that, be like, one, yeah. Sometimes we look for that in an argument. And so here we see it for sure. So the physical distance, just another detail that we could bring in. Let me see what else I have written down here. Oh boy. So some other thoughts, if we're looking at Tertius Lingate, that I would take note of. Notice the use of the pet name. Besides Darling, he also calls her Rosie at one point. He understands her pampered nature and tries to underscore the situation that they're in as temporary. It's only temporary if she can fix her spending. There's an independence to him. We have to see the sympathy. Did you take note of the point that she starts to cry and the reaction it produces in Tertius Lingate? Her tears cut him to the heart. We notice that at times he hardens, something happens, he softens his approach. Bowing his neck, the domestication. We have some of those things. If I'm going to add anything to Rosamond, notice that she immediately colors deeply. They decided to open this with that outward show of emotion on her part. She is, through the whole thing, emotional. She cries. She has the temper at times. If we go with the weeping thing, she weeps. It cuts him to the heart. But I think you would also notice that when she does weep, they mention that she's not given to weeping and she dislikes it. So it's not as though she's using it as an intentional weapon. The third person point of view in this passage allows us the insight into both characters. Sarcastic. Okay, so if we go with this, we have a good idea of the characters, but we notice that the prompt includes a second point. We have to talk about their complex relationship here. So let me offer some suggestions. Can anybody support this statement to show how this is an appropriate one? Their relationship could be described as emotional yet restrained.
Like when she gets emotional or starts to cry back, like he's always like, there's a solution. So it's like it's emotional, but it's like hold it back and we'll get to something.
Yes, they try through this whole thing to focus on solutions, and we notice that when emotions are brought out, it does soften characters. When the emotions do come out, because you mentioned the weeping, does she like it? So we notice as well when they do take that line into an emotional state, we get that definite sense of they don't like it and they kind of pull back continually, whether that emotion is sadness with tears or even anger. When a character does flash out, they are quickly in their head or in their action reticent towards it. They understand they've gone too far. Think about too, I come back to, they are creatures with talons, but with reason too. That restrained quality comes through in that single quote. They understand that they always can hurt, but they understand that hurt does nothing to solve this problem. What about if we change it up and we look at this and we describe them as sympathetic yet domineering? How would we change our approach to looking at these two characters to describe their relationship this way versus this way? We got the sympathetic. At what points could we describe these characters' relationship as domineering?
Maybe they try to like they say.
For sure. Those points that we see them intentionally trying to inflict pain, that definitely has that. They understand their intention there. Look at lines 72 and 73. Towards the end of the conversation, Lingate angrily says, "You must learn to take my judgment on questions you don't understand." Would you describe that as a dominating approach? Now, to counterbalance, we also have to understand that Rosamond has just as much of a dominating presence here. Go back to the top of that column and look at the fact that Tertius Lingate feels as though he is having to bow to the yoke. He understands that this is a problem focused on his wife's spending, and yet he is sort of having to take the burden of it and solving it. Even look at the very end to combine both things that we've looked at. Look at her sarcastic response. She is flashing out in anger, but she's also intending it to be the last word. She is not going to offer any further arguments or suggestions. That's it. And so here, notice that we just changed the words, but does it change the focus of our argument as a whole? And this is where that skill comes into play. Question 2 is looking at how can you discuss it? It's not looking for the right answer. And so students have that openness to go, hey, how do I understand the meaning being built here? Let me give you some other suggestions that avoid using this yet construction, because some of us are still struggling here. What if we simply describe this as a battle of wills? Would we be able to show the same level of complexity by saying that at certain times one is winning and then other times it flips and the other is winning? Absolutely. Who's going to take control? Because even though Tertius Lingate believes by the end of it, he hasn't. You will listen to me. His wife gives that last little snippy comment that allows her to seem like she has won. And then one last one. What about if you view this passage as a conflict between the spoken and the unspoken? Because there's very much what characters say out loud, but because of the third person narration, we're also allowed to see their internal reactions and processing. And so this is very much, I can say something out loud to you, but if my cheeks all of a sudden bloom red, bless you, as though I am embarrassed by what I say, is there a conflict between my words and my reactions? And so consider, there's a lot of nuance to this particular passage. It allows students a lot of opportunities to talk about how they see this relationship. And it's nowhere near the traditional 19th century. The man answers the question, the man handles the business, and the woman sits there and looks pretty. Mm-mm. And so in looking to answer this question, you want to consider, what do you understand best about it? What are those chunks that really lead us to that understanding? And then how can we frame this argument as a whole? So as we go through the rest of the week,